Welcome to the Day's Adventure Podcast. I'm your host, David Visser, and this is episode 13, Justice and the Beul. The war is over. The streets are clearing. The bells have rung themselves raw, and yet, in the heart of Groningen, one building still refuses to disappear. The Scholtenhuis is gone, burned to a skeleton by the Germans as they fled, but its memory stands taller than any tower still left in the city. Its shadow stretches across the Groot Market and across the lives of everyone who once passed through its doors. In our last episode, we spoke of Klaas Carel Faber, a Dutch-born SS executioner whose crimes scarred the northern Netherlands. But history is precise, and so must we be. The man known in post-war records as De Beul van het Scholtenhuis was Robert Wilhelm Lehnhoff, an SD officer whose cruelty filled entire courtroom ledgers in the years that followed. Today, their names, and the names of the men who served beside them, stand at the center of our story. Karl Peter Berg, Willem Feldmann, Klaas Carel Faber, Pieter Johan Faber, Koop or Jacob Koning, and Robert Wilhelm Lehnhoff. The people of Groningen knew these names long before the courts did. Before we step into the trials of Scholtenhuis, we must begin with the moment the Netherlands understood that justice would not be local alone. Hans Alben Reuter, the highest-ranking SS and police commander in the country, ambushed at Woesthoven, a story we explored in episode 5. His survival triggered the execution of 263 Dutch men in reprisal. Reuter was captured in Austria in May of 1945 and brought to the Netherlands to stand trial before the Special Court of Justice in The Hague. His crimes belonged to the nation. And above Reuter stood one more figure in Nazi hierarchy, Arthur Seyss-Inquart, the Reich Commissioner of the Netherlands, Hitler's direct representative, responsible for deportation, forced labor, plunder, starvation policies, and the crushing of Dutch civil rights, all passed through his hands. He was tried at the Nuremberg trials, convicted of war crimes and crimes against humanity, and executed on October 16, 1946. These two national cases form the backdrop, the larger architecture of justice, against which Groningen now prepared to hold its own trials for its own wounds caused by the men who worked inside Scholtenhuis. But the crimes of Scholtenhuis, the interrogations, the beatings, the disappearances, the everyday terror that seeped into Groningen's bones, those belonged to the people who lived here. Groningen prepared for something it had not allowed itself to imagine for years, that justice would walk the same streets where fear once lived. This is episode 13, Justice and the Beul. The last days of April and the first days of May of 1945 were unlike anything the Dutch people had ever lived through. Days when joy, disbelief, exhaustion, and grief were threaded so tightly together that you couldn't pull one emotion without feeling the others tug along with it. April 30th, 1945, Hitler is dead. The news came unevenly across the Netherlands, first through illegal radios, then whispered by Canadian patrols, then confirmed by the BBC broadcast. Adolf Hitler was dead. Crowds didn't erupt into cheers, they froze. A historian recalled, "There's no jubilation, only relief, sharp and sudden, like air returning to the lungs." From my grandfather's journal,
They say Hitler is dead. Neighbors came to our door, not speaking, just looking at one another. For the first time, the silence was not fear.
in London, Queen Wilhelmina, who had spent 5 years broadcasting to her people from exile, addressed the Netherlands with words that captured the moment. The head of tyranny has fallen, but much suffering remains, and much work is yet before us. Her words were both a warning and a promise. The Battle of Delftville Pocket, April 23rd to May 2nd, 1945. While news of Hitler's death moved across Europe, the Netherlands still had one battle left to fight. In the northeast, near the Ems estuary and the German border, German forces dug in for a final stand. But the Canadians pushed through. Flooded fields, shattered farmhouses, impoverished bunkers, heavy naval fire from the German ships on the Ems. It was slow, brutal fighting. Not grand, not strategic, just the last stubborn teeth of a broken regime. On May 2nd, 1945, Delftville Pocket fell, and for the first time since 1940, the Netherlands was whole again. On May 5th, at the Hotel de Welde, German commander Johannes Balutsky formally surrendered all German forces in the Netherlands to Canadian General Charles Foulkes. Across the country, church bells rang, bells that had been silent for years or rung only as warnings. From the archives, a Dutch woman in Groningen later said, "The bells sounded like voices we thought we would never hear again." People poured into the streets, flags appeared from attics, children climbed onto tanks, strangers embraced, bread was shared, windows opened for the first time in years. Queen Wilhelmina issued another message that day, one of gratitude and gravity. The day of liberation has come. May we cherish our freedom, and may we be worthy of it. May 7th to May 8th, 1945, Germany surrenders. On May 7th, Germany signed its unconditional surrender in Reims. On May 8th, it took effect. Victory Day in Europe. The Netherlands celebrated, but with a quiet dignity that surprised many foreign journalists. Across the country, people lit candles, sang in the streets, and prayed in the ruins of churches that had survived the war. From my grandfather's journal,
The war is finished. Some laughed, some cried. I stood still and let the rain fall on my face. It felt like the first clean moment in years.
in those days, the Dutch learned the names of the men who had liberated their villages and the names of the men who would never go home. More than 7,600 Canadians died fighting to free the Netherlands. They lie now in Holten, Bergen, Groesbeek, and the quiet fields tended by Dutch hands. The Dutch never forgot them. To this day, school children adopt their graves, families visit on Liberation Day. Elderly Dutch citizens still say They died for our tomorrow. From my grandfather's journal.
They look so young. I counted the years they lived, and the years we lived because of them.
With the country finally free, with Hitler dead, with the last German strongholds broken, and with the surrender signed, the Netherlands turned inward. The joy of liberation gave way to questions. And the questions led to rooms filled with judges, witnesses, and the men whose crimes had darkened the North. The trials were about to begin. After liberation, the Netherlands did not rush towards justice. It walked, slow, steady, and deliberate. Justice required names, evidence, testimony, and courage. In Groningen, that work fell first to the people who had risked everything during the occupation, the resistance. And for the city itself, it fell especially to Group 2000, the network my grandfather worked with. Group 2000 had not spent 5 years fighting only with guns, sabotage, or forged documents. They had also been collecting names, carefully, secretly, knowing that one day the war would end and the truth would matter. The pages were smudged from hands that had passed them from farmhouse to safe house. Some were written in pencil, some in ink, some in code. But now, in the quiet after liberation, those names were placed on tables in front of the Canadian officers and the Dutch police. From my grandfather's journal.
We bring the lists. They are heavier than any weapons we carried. Some names are written clearly. Others we whisper, not out of fear, but because speaking them aloud feels unclean.
On those lists were the men who now sat at the center of the unfolding trials. Karl Peter Berg, Senior SD Commander in Groningen. Willem Feldmann, interrogator known in testimonies for his brutality. Klaas Carel Faber, SS executioner active throughout the northern provinces. Pieter Johan Faber, arrests, intimidations, reprisals. Koop, Koning, Dutch police collaborator aiding the SD. Robert Wilhelm Lehnhoff, the man later known as the executioner of Scholtenhuis. These names were not rumors. Their names surfaced in the same places: survivor testimonies, resistance notes, and municipal files, each one confirming the next. The Canadian military police, together with the Dutch Special Court of Justice, followed a steady rhythm. They found the men on the lists, verified who they were, placed them under guard, moved them into holding cells, and began the meticulous paperwork that would shape the trials to come. Some arrests were quiet, others drew crowds that had to be pushed back. The Canadians understood the danger. Justice could not look like revenge. A report from the military authority described their policy plainly: maintain control, prevent reprisals, protect the integrity of the trials. This was not mercy towards perpetrators. It was safeguarding the future. Accounts from the archives. We know these men. We saw them on our streets. Now they walk between Canadian guards. The crowd stays silent. It is a different kind of victory. As interrogations continued, the public began to hear fragments of truth that had been impossible to confirm during the war. Under Karl Peter Berg, the Scholtenhuis became the beating black heart of terror in the north. Everyone in Groningen knew the stories: whispers at the markets, muttering at the doorways, of the torturer and the executioner inside. men who tortured prisoners beneath the flickering lamps of the SD headquarters. Survivors would later testify how arrests were carried out with cold, mechanical efficiency. Doors kicked in, questions barked, and then the long disappearance into the building on the Groot Market, where the sinister SS flag snapped in the wind. One eyewitness described an attempted execution where 4 shots missed, and even the coup de grace misfired. A moment of cruelty so routine that a man's wife's screams barely rose above the city's dread. Under Berg's direction, the SD reach extended everywhere. A rumor, a flower on a hedge, a name whispered in the wrong ear, all could summon an arrest. The Scholtenhuis was more than a building. Under Berg, it was a machine built for fear. Under Willem Feldmann, cruelty at the Scholtenhuis took on a personal shape, sharp, deliberate, and unmistakably sadistic. If Berg was the cold machinery of terror, Feldmann was its hands and its knuckles, the man the prisoners remembered not for orders barked, but for the blow that followed. His reputation carried through Groningen like a cold draft under a locked door. People spoke his name the way one might speak of a coming storm, quietly, with eyes lowered, as if saying it too loudly might summon him. Survivors testified that Feldmann's interrogation followed a script written in fear. A fist, a boot, a question, silence, and then a fist again. Those who returned from Scholtenhuis limping or being carried spoke of Feldmann's precision, the way he seemed to hurt people clinically, as if cruelty itself was an occupation he had perfected. His presence in the hallway meant the beatings would be personal. He did not outsource pain. The details appear repeatedly in the Dutch post-war files and the Tribune testimonies. Prisoners dragged across floors, blows delivered until ribs cracked. Men and women left half-conscious, revived with water only to be questioned again. Witnesses noted his particular enjoyment in humiliating those who called illegalen, the resistance members who challenged the German order. They described his expression not as rage, but satisfaction, a man who believed the pain he inflicted was not only permitted, but righteous. After liberation, the stories poured out. Shocked Dutch investigators documented injuries still visible weeks after interrogations. Survivors described him without a metaphor. He hit because he wanted to. He smiled while he worked. He did not need orders. Where Berg's leadership turned the Scholtenhuis into a machine, Feldmann ensured that the gears never stopped grinding. He embodied the intimate violence of occupation, not the grand strategies, but the hand raised against the helpless. To encounter Feldmann was to understand the dangers in Groningen was not only systematic, it had a face, a voice, and a name spoken quietly across the city. Klaas Carel Faber was the executioner who made death feel inevitable. Where Feldmann left bruises, Faber left bodies. His violence did not have the intimacy of a fist or the unpredictable rage of a sadist. His cruelty was colder than that, mechanical, obedient, almost transactional. Faber didn't torture to savor the suffering. He killed because it was efficient, because it was his duty, because he believed the people in front of him did not deserve to breathe. The Dutch archives describe him without flourish. SS man, execution squad, Westbroek, Drenthe, Groningen, guilty of multiple murders. A man who received his orders, carried them out, and walked away without looking back. Survivors rarely spoke of him directly, not because they forgot him, but because Faber left no witnesses. Those who survived his presence survived by accident, not mercy. He operated on the forest's edges, behind barns, on quiet roads outside Essen and Westbroek. places where gunfire echoed without leaving a trace. He worked with his brother Pieter Johan Faber, the two of them moving through the north like a pair of shadows that never arrived alone. Dutch tribunal summaries note their names again and again, not in the basement rooms of the Scholtenhuis, but in the ledgers of the condemned. Where Feldmann beat people into silence, Faber ended the story altogether. In Groningen's post-war investigations, the Faber brothers' signatures appeared in the record of firing squads, reprisal killings, and special actions. No theatrics, no improvisation, just execution. A task carried out like a ledger line, a life removed, a page turned. Witnesses described Klaas not by his face, but by his posture, straight, expressionless, immovable. A man who never hesitated, never asked questions, never appeared to doubt the righteousness of what he did. And when the war ended, and the Dutch courts finally laid the evidence before him, his reaction was chilling as his crimes. He showed no remorse, no regret, no recognition of the human lives he had taken. If the Fabers were feared for the violence they carried out, Koop Koning was feared for the violence he enabled. He wore no German uniform. He did not come from Berlin or Hamburg. He came from Groningen, a Dutchman, helping the occupiers hunt down his own people. That was what made him dangerous. The Dutch archives describe Koning as a collaborator who knew the city too well, the alleys where resistance couriers met, the homes where illegal radios were kept, the families who whispered too freely, the neighbors who asked the wrong questions. He did not need to raise a weapon. All he needed to do was speak a name. Survivors testified that Koning supplied the SD with personal details, where someone worked, who their relatives were, which farmers would hide a fugitive, which shopkeeper might be trusted. It was the intimacy of his knowledge that chilled investigators, a Dutchman pointing to Dutch homes, so German officers could knock down doors and drag people to Scholtenhuis. For many in Groningen, his betrayal cut deeper than anything the Germans themselves did. The enemy you expect, the collaborator you don't. After liberation, his name appeared repeatedly in police reports and resistance files, not as a man who tortured or killed, but as a man whose choices made torture and killing possible. During his trial, he showed the same calm detachment he had shown during the occupation. No regret, no apology, just the steady insistence that he had done what was required. He didn't carry out the violence of Scholtenhuis. He carried it to the doorstep of his own neighbors, and sometimes that kind of betrayal is the hardest to forgive. Berg was the machinery of the Scholtenhuis, and Feldmann its fists, and the Faber brothers its gunshots in the dark. Then Robert Wilhelm Lehnhoff was the man who turned cruelty into ritual. The Dutch did not give him the name the executioner of Scholtenhuis lightly. He earned it, not through rumor, not through exaggeration, but through the testimonies of dozens of survivors and the bodies of those who never came home. Lehnhoff arrived in Groningen with a purpose that revealed itself quickly. Survivors described his presence in the corridors as a moment when the entire building seemed to tighten. Guards shifted, prisoners fell silent, and even seasoned SD officers stepped aside. He had a way of entering a room that survivors never forgot, calm, almost polite, as if what came next was nothing more than an administrative procedure. But what came next was always violence. Tribunal records detailed his methods with cold precision. Prisoners dragged by the hair into basement rooms, interrogations that ended not in confessions but in collapse, executions carried out with the efficiency of a man fulfilling a timetable, decisions made without hesitation, as if life and death were clerical entries in a ledger. Where Feldmann struck with anger or satisfaction, Lehnhoff struck with purpose. His brutality had no theatrics, no outbursts, no visible pleasure. And that made it even more terrifying. Survivors spoke of his voice, quiet, measured, controlled, and of the moments just before the beatings began, when the room would go unnaturally still. Those who were brought before him rarely returned in the same conditions. Some never returned at all. In Dutch archives, his name appears beside 28 confirmed murders, though the tribunal noted that the real number was almost certainly higher. He personally ordered or carried out executions in Scholtenhuis, in the forest outside Groningen, and in locations kept off the books. But the most haunting accounts speak of the way Lehnhoff paused before his final act, not to reconsider, but to ensure it was done correctly. A methodical executioner, a man who believed killing was simply another duty. By the time of his trial in May of 1949, the case file against him was so thick it required 2 clerks to carry it into the courtroom. 75 witnesses took the stand. Their testimonies were chilling, consistent, and devastating in their detail. The judges listened. The gallery sat frozen. Even seasoned investigators later wrote that this was the darkest case they had ever handled. One by one, the verdicts came in, and the sentences were delivered. Karl Peter Berg, the senior SD commander, received the death penalty. His execution was carried out on December 22, 1949. For the North, it marked the end of a shadow that had stretched across an entire occupation. Willem Feldmann, remembered in testimony after testimony for his brutality, was also sentenced to death. But political tides shifted. Feldmann's death sentence was commuted. He served roughly a decade in prison before being released under the clemency wave of the early 1950s. Pieter Johan Faber, one of the infamous Faber brothers, was sentenced to death and executed on December 8, 1948. Klaas Carel Faber, the more notorious of the two, was sentenced to death as well, then commuted to life. Of all the stories that come out of the trials, one stayed with me more than the rest, not because of its brutality, there was enough of that to fill a lifetime, but because of the injustice that followed. It is the story of Klaas Carel Faber, a man convicted of murder after murder, a man whose name appeared in execution sites across the North, a man my grandfather once said carried death the way other men carried tools. He was sentenced to die, and for a moment the Netherlands believed that part of the war would be finally closed. But it didn't. In 1952, Faber escaped from the Breda prison and walked across the border into Germany, a border that might as well have been a wall of iron, because the moment he stepped onto German soil, he became a man protected not by mercy, but by law, Nazi law. Back in 1943, the Nazis had passed a decree that gave automatic German citizenship to anyone who had joined the Waffen-SS. Faber had joined eagerly. So in the eyes of post-war Germany, he wasn't a Dutch murderer who needed to be returned. He was a German citizen, and German citizens could not be extradited, not for political crimes, not for murder, not even for the execution of unarmed civilians, and Germany had no desire to reopen the case. The Cold War was beginning. The West needed a stable German ally. Every courtroom hour spent on the former SS man felt like a step in the wrong direction. So when the Dutch sent extradition requests again and again for decades, Germany said no. When the Dutch begged Germany to retry him on German soil, they said no. When families wrote letters asking how a man who had taken so many lives could live freely, Germany answered with silence, or with the same legal phrase repeated like a wall: German citizens cannot be extradited. And just like that, a man who had executed others without hesitation lived the rest of his life in comfort, under the protection of a country that had insisted its hands were tied. My grandfather never forgot that. Many Dutch families never forgave it. Some wounds do not heal. They simply just stop bleeding. His escape is still a wound for Dutch families who waited for justice that never arrived. Klaas Carel Faber died May 24, 2012. Then came the sentencing for Koop Koning, the Dutch collaborator. The betrayal that stung the deepest. Received a prison sentence of 10 to 20 years. He served his years and was released under the clemency wave of the early 1950s. And then there was Robert Wilhelm Lehnhoff, the man known as the executioner of Scholtenhuis. I often imagine my grandfather sitting in that courtroom, hearing those verdicts, feeling a mixture of relief and sorrow that can't be named. After the verdicts, as the courtrooms emptied and the names of the condemned faded into the quiet hum of the city, the Netherlands stepped into a new reality, one that was free but devastated. My grandfather used to say that liberation was not a doorway you walk through, it was rubble you climbed over. And in the months after May 1945, the Dutch learned just how much had been taken from them. The Netherlands was a country in pieces. The Germans had not just occupied the Netherlands, they had extracted it, drained it, and in many places broke it intentionally. Across the provinces, the land bore scars. Whole polders lay underground, intentionally flooded by retreating German forces trying to slow the Allied advances. Bridges were blown apart, roads left cratered and broken, railways twisted into useless knots of metal. Factories stood hollow, their machinery stripped and hauled east to Germany. Harbors were choked with scuttled ships, deliberately sunk to block supply routes. Warehouses that once held grain echoed empty. The food had been taken, the livestock slaughtered or driven off before liberation arrived. Churches had been shelled, schools seized for German use. The entire rows of houses were left riddled with bullets or burned to their foundations. The Netherlands was free again, but it was a freedom that came standing in the ruins of nearly everything it had built. The north, Groningen, and Friesland had been especially battered. Journal entries and government reports from the summer of 1945 described villages where entire farms were gone, where barns were nothing more than black ribs on the landscape, where people still lived among unexploded shells that Canadian and Dutch disposal units worked desperately to remove. Raman's historical count notes, the Netherlands emerged from the war among the most heavily damaged countries in Western Europe. The hunger winter of 1944 to 1945 had left whole regions malnutritioned. Some families still lived on rations from Canadian emergency kitchens long after liberation. Children were underweight. Adults looked 20 years older than they were. From my grandfather's journal,
People walk like ghosts. They smile when the Canadians pass, but their faces show the winter we survived.
and there was more than hunger. Thousands of men who had been deported for forced labor were returning from Germany, thin, traumatized, and searching for work in a country that had none. Manufacturing was barely breathing. In Rotterdam, bomb blitzes had flattened whole districts. In Groningen, factories were looted or converted into German supply depots. Coal was scarce, electricity unreliable, raw materials non-existent. Dutch economists of the time described it as an economy without tools, without power, without raw goods. You can't restart a factory if you don't even have the bolts to fix the machines. The Netherlands had always been a farming country, a land of orchards, clean fields, and green pastures stitched together like a patchwork quilt. But after the war, even the soil was wounded. The Germans had left devastation in their wake. Farmlands were deliberately flooded and turned into shallow saltwater lakes to halt the Allied advance. leaving behind soil so infiltrated with salt that farmers would wait 3 years before the fields would produce food again. Cattle were slaughtered or driven off, feeds stolen to supply retreating units. Barns that once sheltered harvests were burned until only their blackened ribs remained. Irrigation canals were shattered, and plows and tractors were confiscated or tossed aside, rusting in ditches where they had been abandoned in the chaos of retreat. And in places where German convoys burned or supply depots exploded, the fields were stained with diesel and oil. Dark patches where nothing would grow for seasons. Farmers returned home to find their land riddled with shrapnel, their orchards cut down for firewood, their meadows scarred by tanks and shell craters. Some said the earth itself felt poisoned, as if the ground had lived through the occupation and carried its own memory of suffering. One farmer wrote in 1945, "We did not sow, we survived." The Dutch government warned of 3 more years of food instability, even with Allied aid. Bombings, scorched earth retreats, and population displacement left tens of thousands of Dutch families without housing. In Groningen, families doubled up in single rooms, neighbors taking strangers in, some living in haylofts, some in barns, some wherever the walls still stood. Children played among the ruins because there was no other place to go. As the trials began, the resistance faced its own reckoning. For 5 years, groups like Group 2000, the LO, the KP, and dozens of local cells had carried the weight of a hidden nation on their backs. They had forged documents in candlelit kitchens, hidden weapons beneath floorboards, planned raids in barns and back rooms, smuggled prisoners under the noses of German patrols, carried messages folded in matchboxes or tucked inside bread, and watched Nazis from shadowed windows with the patience of hunters. Then, almost overnight, it was over. What had been essential became unnecessary. What had once defined their days and nights vanished into the quiet of peace. There were no more documents to forge, no more safe houses to rotate, no more curfews to slip through, no more fugitives to shepherd through back alleys, and no more footsteps in the dark to listen for. Some resistance members put on new uniforms and became police officers. Others joined reconstruction programs, using their discipline and precision to rebuild the country they had fought to protect. Many returned to the jobs they'd left in 1940, stepping back into workshops, farms, classrooms, as if 5 years of shadows could be folded up and tucked away like an old coat. But not everyone adapted easily. For some, the silence of peacetime was louder than gunfire. The adrenaline that had carried them through the occupation collapsed into exhaustion, confusion, or grief. They had survived the war, but learning how to live again was its own kind of battle. There was pride, there was relief, but there was also confusion. The resistance had given everything, and now the country had to gently fold them back into ordinary life. Many Dutch resistors suffered quietly from trauma, nightmares, guilt, or the sudden emptiness of peacetime. But they had done what history asked of them, and the Netherlands, broken, hungry, and grieving, needed them to become citizens again. By 1947, the truth had settled over the Netherlands like a long, unavoidable shadow. The country simply could not rebuild fast enough to support every young family. Factories were still empty. Farmland was still healing. Housing shortages stretched into entire communities. And for the generation who had come of age under occupation, the future felt too small for the size of their hopes. That was when the first spark of the great immigration wave began. The Dutch government, overwhelmed by the scale of national recovery, quietly encouraged young couples to look beyond its borders. Posters appeared in community halls. Church leaders spoke of opportunities overseas. Newspapers printed ads for farmland abroad. Families discussed in low voices around kitchen tables, wondering what a new life might really mean. Canada, wide skies, steady wages, farmland waiting for hands to tend it, quickly became the brightest possibility. It offered sponsorship through farming families, assisted travel, stable work, and something the Netherlands couldn't yet promise: room to grow. People said Canada felt like a place where the land itself was ready to welcome you. And my grandparents were exactly the kind of couple those programs were meant for: young, resilient, unafraid of hard work, and determined to give their future children a life untouched by hunger, fear, and uncertainty. For them, looking outward wasn't abandoning the Netherlands. It was choosing a horizon wide enough to hold the rest of their lives. But before my grandparents could look outward, before immigration papers, sponsors, or the dreams of Canada, something far more important happened. Something quiet, something human. They found each other. After years of fear and ration cards and whispered warnings in the night, the Netherlands began to breathe again. And with that breathing came music. Community dances became lifelines. Church halls where the windows rattled from world gramophones. Community centers where bicycles lined up in rows against the brick walls outside. Rooms that had echoed with silence, now filled with laughter and the shuffle of shoes on wooden floors. It was one of those rooms, in late 1945, that my grandfather met the woman who would become my grandmother. He had survived the occupation with his quiet strength intact, but the war rested heavy on his shoulders. She carried her own scars, but she carried light too, and he noticed her the instant she stepped into the room. They danced, they talked, and for the first time in years, my grandfather laughed, a small, surprising, fragile sound that reminded him he was still alive. That night, the world did not feel quite so broken. By November 1945, they were going steady, an expression my grandfather wrote with shy pride in his journal. They married in 1947, two young people building a life in a country trying to stitch itself together. And in November 1952, they welcomed their first child, my father. For a while, it looked as though they might live out their lives in the Netherlands. But the country was still struggling, the land still tired, the economy still too small to hold the dreams of a new generation. And so, 6 months after my father was born, opportunity and necessity called them across the ocean. A new life begins in 1953. They boarded a plane bound for Canada, not a ship, a metal bird carrying everything they owned, their hope, their courage, and a little boy bundled in blankets. As they descended into Toronto in late spring of 1953, the air below them opened up like a promise. My grandmother held my father close. My grandfather pressed his forehead to the window, watching the land rise to meet them. A land with no bombed-out streets, no curfews, no Scholtenhuis casting a shadow over the town square. They stepped onto Canadian soil with 2 suitcases and a determination to build a life their son could grow into without fear. Their new story began in that moment, a story born from courage, woven across continents, and carried forward through the generations until it reached me. And that is where the next chapter of Woven in Courage begins. That's it for this episode of The Day's Adventure. Remember, stay curious, stay engaged, and never stop chasing the next great adventure. The world is full of wonders, and your next journey is just one episode away. To keep the adventure alive, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Blue Sky. And don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel for the video versions and exclusive behind-the-scenes content. Want more? Hit subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you'll never miss the next thrilling episode. The world's waiting. See you next time on The Day's Adventure.